Greetings and welcome to the Inner Mileage channel. My name is Dr. Narcissistic Transformational Coach here at Inner Mileage, where we help individuals, families, and groups transform, heal, and overcome the blocks that are in the way of resonant and aligned impact in their personal and professional lives. Today, we want to talk a little bit about narcissistic abuse and generational trauma. In other words, what is the connective tissue between narcissistic abuse and generational trauma and how one can break free? See, this isn't just about what's here and now. It's about the patterns when we talk about narcissistic abuse and generational trauma that have been passed down through generation, often unconsciously. And as we look into these patterns, we will uncover how they continue, what they are, and what you can do about it. Importantly, we'll discuss how these experiences can awaken the empath in the family and how ultimately these chains of trauma can be broken. If you've ever felt trapped in a cycle of pain and dysfunction, this video is for you. Now, to start, it's important to understand generational trauma. Generational trauma, also known as intergenerational trauma, refers to the transmission of emotional pain and dysfunction from one generation to the next. And this often begins with a significant traumatic event, something that may have happened in the family, a war, a natural disaster, profound emotional abuse, something that really affects the psychological state of a person. And if the trauma isn't fully processed or healed, it gets passed down subtly through influencing of behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of the descendants of the original ancestor where the abuse or the trauma started from. And in families where narcissism takes root, this trauma manifests as a pervasive need for control, superiority, and all kinds of unnecessary validation. In fact, a parent likely struggling with their own unresolved trauma may develop narcissistic traits as a defense mechanism. And they project these insecurities, this parent, and failures onto their children. An example I've often given was when I was 17, my own father told me I was going to be a failure, right? And you know where that comes from, the projection. Now, these insecurities projected from the parents creeps into the children. And it begins to perpetuate this cycle, this state of abuse. And the child in turn grows up with a distorted sense of self-worth, often oscillating between feelings of inadequacy and a desperate need to please. Do you see? And this is how this kind of trauma is studied. In fact, the Journal of Traumatic Stress highlights how trauma from one generation can significantly alter the biological makeup and stated responses of the next generation. This means that children of trauma survivors, whether the trauma is explicit or insidious, are predisposed to higher levels of anxiety, depression, and a distorted sense of self. And these children are most likely to develop narcissistic traits or conversely become highly sensitive empaths, something that one person personally identifies with. Now, the continuation of generational trauma and narcissistic abuse occurs in a cycle, one that's often not very visible until someone decides to break it, which is why it's very difficult to catch it, you see, and why it continues and it perpetuates. In fact, in narcissistic families, the cycle is perpetuated through roles and expectations, and they're passed down like family heirlooms, right? Children are often assigned roles such as the golden child, this is the perfect child who can do no wrong, or the scapegoat who bears the brunt of a family dysfunction. These roles also serve to maintain the narcissist control, or the narcissistic parent's control, whoever is the originating narcissist, let's say, in the next hierarchy of a family lineage, begins to develop his archetypes. In fact, the golden child, for example, is showered with praise, not because they're inherently praiseworthy, but because they reflect the narcissist's idealized image of themselves. The scapegoat, on the other hand, or the empath, or the black sheep, is blamed for the family problems and serves as an outlet for the narcissistic parents' unresolved rage and insecurity. And this cycle continues as children conditioned into these roles either continue the cycle, they continue the same dynamics, or if they're not aware, make it worse. And in cases where they are aware, there's a struggle to break free from it, which is why people remain stuck in these cycles. And the impact is profound, leading to a range of issues, from lack of self-esteem and self-worth to depression and anxiety, difficulty maintaining long-term relationships, etc., 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 etc. Now, to truly grasp the weight of narcissistic abuse and generational trauma, it's important to define what these terms are and how they are viewed, particularly by those who study these in great detail, whether they're academics, psychologists, and so forth. In fact, narcissistic abuse is a form of emotional abuse by someone with the traits, the narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. And this abuse can be subtle, like constant critiques or gaslighting and manipulation. And they're all projections of the narcissist's insecurities, but it's done in a Jedi tricky kind of way that the recipient of the abuse begins to think they're the problem. Now, the awakened empath can see through this and know that the narcissist is simply projecting their problems onto the empath. But this can be very difficult to figure out because it's very subtle. And the goal of the narcissist is to maintain power and control over their victims. And the reason for this is because it feeds their ego at the expense of the other person's mental health and well-being. Now, generational trauma, as we've alluded to previously, is the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. Simply, this trauma can be emotional, psychological, or even physical. And it manifests in all kinds of behaviors and attitudes and responses, particularly program responses that are disproportionate to what's really happening. I mean, imagine going to a Thanksgiving dinner with a narcissistic family or a family get-together, and all these old resentments resurface, and it's not obvious what's happening to the untrained eye, but the reason why these dynamics are happening is because there's unresolved family trauma. Unresolved family trauma. And these traumas I've described, narcissistic abuse, generational trauma, often are viewed as silent epidemics, right? Because they're deeply embedded in families and communities, and they can go unnoticed for generations and generations and generations. And in fact, it's often been described by academics like the Journal of Psychology and Psychiatry as an invisible inheritance. Can you imagine this? That you inherit something invisibly from your two parents, perhaps from your 4 grandparents, right? Then your 8 great-grandparents, then the 16 before them, then the 32 before them, the 64 before them, the 128 before them, the 256 before them, and the 512 before them. That's going back 7 generations, according to the National Institute of Health. So there's at least 1,000 people prior to you who couldn't break the cycle, whatever the trauma was. And so you imagine one person waking up from a lineage of about 1,000 previous ancestors who couldn't break this cycle. It's no wonder breaking generational trauma is so difficult, because if it wasn't, every single person will be doing it. It's very hard to do. Now, the impact of these traumas is so far-reaching. In fact, children who grow up in these environments often struggle with who they are, a sense of ability, a sense of identity, the ability to trust people, and even develop self-love. And as a result, become narcissistic themselves because they develop these traits they observed in their nurtured environments, and end up living out those traits because that's all they know, or Um, it may trigger an empath to become more empathic, you see. After going through the pain of empathy, develop the skills to become a greatly empathic person. Now, in these family dynamics where there happens to be an empath, the empath can either be a blessing or a lesson to the family. And either way, it triggers spiritual awakening. In fact, case in point, in many narcissistic families, one child may emerge as the empath, a person with a heightened sensitivity to the energies of others. And whilst this trait is a gift, in a narcissistic environment, it can be a curse because there's so much going on. And the empath becomes a sponge, absorbing the pain, the frustrations, the anger of the narcissist, and struggling to maintain their own sense of self. Watching what's dad's mood today, what's mom's mood, or what's everybody's mood, and really getting to this heightened sense of survival because of a lack of safety in the environment, for example. But here's where change can happen. The empath, by their very nature, holds the key to breaking the cycle of generational trauma. I'll say that again. The empath, by its very nature, holds the key to breaking generational trauma in a family with such a dynamic. Because the empath is the first to recognize that something is deeply wrong, even if they can't quite articulate it. This is something I can relate to. And this recognition is the real beginning of the awakening. I think about my experience even in my second marriage and understanding what I was observing even when I couldn't articulate it. Now, as the empath becomes more aware, the empath starts to question the role that they've been assigned as the scapegoat and the narratives they've been fed. You start to wonder. There was even a time where even in my family, there was a nickname used for me, Jimmy Pachacha. In the local parlance, meaning stupid, right? Because I kept giving as an empath and not realizing that it was misperceived as weakness and stupidity. And so what happens is the empath begins to see the patterns of abuse and manipulation for what they are, really defense mechanisms that are projected from their narcissists because of their unhealed trauma. And this recognition can be very, very jarring, very painful, very, very, very heart-wrenching. And it splits you open. And it's the moment when the empath begins to reclaim their power. Out of that pain, it's where this sense of power begins to come in. Now, this process is not for the faint of heart, because you begin to realize that the people that you loved, the people around you, are not who you thought they were. And you begin to actually understand why you were a misfit in that family and how you were conditioned in that dynamic to chase, and how that dynamic also conditioned you to veer away from your true calling and purpose. And in fact, the generational trauma is like a spell, because no one's able to break out from it easily. It's almost like crabs in a bucket. One crab trying to get out, the others bring it back in. And so seeing the insidiousness of narcissistic abuse in families takes real observation and intelligence. And if you're so lucky to have the experience to begin to see narcissistic dynamics in your family for what it is, you should be thankful that your eyes have been opened to be able to peek behind the veil, to be able to see behind the mask. All the masks have begun to slip around you. And the reason you can see what you see in the family dynamic is because a certain level of healing you've already done, even though you may not have been aware that you were doing so, is the reason why you've developed the emotional maturity and intuition to begin to see things as they are, not as you imagine them to be. Now, previously, your imagination and your empathic nature filled in the gaps, so much so that the narcissist's bad behavior was not apparent, because you compensated for that with your positive energy and your empathic compassion. But when the veil slips, you begin to see just how everybody around you thought loved you actually does not. And that can be very jarring because you realize you are a prey surrounded by predators. You're sort of a lamb surrounded by scorpions and snakes. And scorpions and snakes ordinarily are sentient beings, nothing wrong with them. But we understand the identity of scorpions and snakes used here as a metaphor for treachery, for manipulation, for dark energies. And this is what this trauma feels like because it's so insidious. I recall making a reference to the National Institute of Health study that trauma is passed on generationally. That's all it is. And it's also passed on through a process known as epigenetics. So not only is a trauma passed on based on what you see and observe in the environment, it's also passed on through DNA transmission in the blood, through the DNA. And that process is called epigenetics. So you realize that a lot of the trauma that you may hold may not even be yours. This is accumulated, inherited trauma, as I previously alluded to. And so waking up to this reality is actually the beginning of reclaiming your best and true life. Now, the journey from waking up to alignment to your true life is a long one, a painful one. And in fact, the archetypes mentioned by the great writer Joseph Campbell in his works on the hero's journey kind of take you through that process a little bit, but that's not the point of this video. This video is simply focused on how narcissistic abuse is passed on as generational trauma, and in many ways how the awakening of the empath begins to end that cycle. So you see how insidious all of this is. And so I want to end here with an overview of recognizing that ending generational trauma is no small feat, but it is possible. And it begins with awareness and intentional action. Excuse me. Hey Siri, alarm off. Apologies for that. And it's important to recognize some tips that can actually help you go through breaking the cycle of narcissistic abuse and trauma in your family. So I'll go through some steps, a few patterns or steps very quickly. One is the ability to recognize that it is a pattern, right? So the first step is awareness. Start by recognizing the patterns and behaviors in your family, things that you've taken for granted and haven't paid great attention to, and identify the roles that are assigned and question their validity. Are these helping? Are they harming us? What's going on? So recognize the patterns, and being able to recognize the patterns itself is a great victory, because narcissism ordinarily is so insidious and multidimensional, it's very difficult to make sense of it when it's happening. It's usually in retrospect that the full picture becomes obvious. 2, seek professional help from coaches like myself who have the credentials, but also the life experience of having experienced narcissistic abuse and escaped narcissistic dynamics. I also work with other mental health professionals who've got the same exposure and experience, whether they're lawyers or therapists or counselors and so forth. So that's really, really important. Number 3, set boundaries. Get used to setting boundaries, because the reason why you were abusable as an empath was because your boundaries were easily encroached. So the ability to set really firm boundaries really makes a difference in helping to break that cycle. And this is very difficult for someone who's not experienced in setting boundaries because they're conditioned as a people pleaser. Now, after you've set effective boundaries, the 4th is to engage in, and I'm a big fan of this, self-healing and self-care practices. So rather than waiting for someone to do it for you, you do it for yourself. Buy yourself flowers. Go on that solo trip. Go to that restaurant by yourself. Go get that massage. Go take that walk. Go spend some time in nature. Go hiking. Go take that swim. Spend time with your children. Spend time with loved ones who care about you and are like you. Remove yourself from dynamics that don't serve you. All these things that can be self-care. Whatever it is, journal. Whatever gets you to a place of equanimity, calmness, and clarity, you practice, particularly if it's wholesome and useful. And number 5, importantly, once you've gone through a healing process, it's important to break the silence. In fact, one of the most powerful ways to end generational trauma is to break the cycle. And you do so by talking about your experiences, sharing your story, and encouraging others in your family if there's still that possibility for you to do so. This not only helps in your healing, but also sets a new precedent for future generations. One where pain is acknowledged and not ignored, and healing is prioritized over these false images of perfection. So in conclusion, beautiful people, beloveds, wonderful people, narcissistic abuse and generational trauma are deeply intertwined. Both create cycles of pain and dysfunction for generations and generations and generations. But the power to break this cycle lies within you. Yes, it does. Especially if you're an empath. Your sensitivity, your awareness, and your commitment to healing are the keys to end this traumatic cycle that have been passed down to you unwittingly. And we at the Inner Mind are very skilled in helping you navigate this because our focus here is on the power of healing and transformation. If you're on this journey of waking up to generational trauma and narcissistic abuse, know that you're not alone. And we're here to support you every step of the way, providing the tools and guidance to help you. You can book a free session at our website at innermind.com. And I want to end by saying thank you for spending time, for watching to this point in the video. If this resonated with you, please share it with others who might benefit from these insights. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can be informed whenever we post new videos. Together, we can create a future where healing and love replace pain and dysfunction. Remember, there's no one like you. Peace.